fundamental problem, I think, with those of us who oppose the culture of permanent war is that we live in a system which the political philosopher Sheldon Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism. And by that, he means that it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader. It's not about a radical or reactionary movement that seeks to overthrow a decaying structure and replace its iconography and language. It is about a movement that finds its expression in the anonymity of the corporate state. And this corporate state purports to pay fealty to electoral politics, the Constitution, the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet has seized all of the internal levers of power to render the citizenry impotent. In a system of inverted totalitarianism, there is the facade of the old structure, while internally what has happened is that we have, as a country, in fact, undergone a kind of coup d'etat in slow motion. And any discussion of war, I think, has to recognize that the formal mechanisms of power by which incremental and piecemeal change were once made possible no longer function. There is no way we have as citizens to appeal to the power structure to promote our interests. And the greatest crime of the Obama administration, for me, is the codification of the destruction of domestic and international law that was put in place by the Bush administration. Whether that is preemptive war, which under post-Nuremberg laws is a criminal war of aggression, whether that is the continuance of torture in our offshore penal colonies, whether that is the looting of the U.S. Treasury on behalf of speculative concerns in Wall Street. Remember, speculators in the 17th century in Europe were hung. Speculation was a crime. The Obama administration has not even found it within itself to restore habeas corpus. I'm part of the ACLU lawsuit against the government over the FISA Reform Act, in which a democratically controlled Congress passed a bill that retroactively made legal what under our Constitution is illegal, and that is the warrantless wiretapping and monitoring and eavesdropping of tens of millions of American citizens. So how do you respond effectively when you can no longer appeal to established liberal institutions, including the Democratic Party, to carry out meaningful reform? And of course, that's why none of these institutions or any of these figures even discuss the surveillance and security state and the permanent war economy. And they won't discuss it because they're hostage to it. And that presents us with an extremely difficult situation. And David and I have been together in Washington with Veterans for Peace and Iraq Veterans Against the War. I think it forces us to accept that the only route we have left is to sever ourselves from mainstream institutions, to accept that reform will not come by collaborating with these institutions, and to grasp that the only mechanism now is civil disobedience. Acts of civil disobedience, as my friend Wendell Berry, who just occupied the governor's office in Kentucky to protest mountaintop removal, said, this is more time than I care to donate to the federal government. But unfortunately, we're going to have to find it within ourselves to donate that time. And if we don't do it, civil society in this country will die. We are the last thin line of defense between the maintenance of a civil society based on the consent of the governed and nonviolence, and the rise of very frightening proto-fascist movements which embrace the gun culture, the language of bigotry, and overt racism towards Muslims, towards gays, towards intellectuals, towards undocumented workers. I covered the breakdown of the former Yugoslavia for the New York Times, and so much of what I experienced there I see reflected in the political, social, and cultural deterioration within the United States. The function of a liberal class is to provide a kind of safety valve. That's what the liberal class did with the New Deal. As Conrad Black said in his biography of Roosevelt, Roosevelt's greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. But when that liberal class no longer functions, when you have 6 million people pushed from their homes because of fraudulent and criminal activity by banks and financial institutions, a number that is expected to climb to 10 million by next year, when you have 1 million families a year declaring personal bankruptcy because they can't pay their medical bills, when we have shoved down our throats so-called health care reform bill, which the 2,000 pages of which are written by lobbyists, a bill that becomes the equivalent of the bank bailout bill for the pharmaceutical and insurance industry, $400 billion in subsidies, and now we're watching Obama hand out exemptions because these companies don't want to insure chronically ill children. It is legally permitted in the United States to hold a sick child hostage while their parents bankrupt themselves trying to save their sons or daughters. This is the country we live in, and the Democrats are as culpable for this and responsible for this as the Republican Party. Appeals to Obama's better nature are as effective as writing letters to Uncle Joe Stalin about the famine in the Ukraine, as if only he knew and he would rectify it. Unlike George Bush, Obama is intelligent. He understands the centers of power. He knows what has to be done to placate them. And I think we who care about the protection of civil society forgot that it is not our job to take power, that there are two sets of principles that we can adhere to. The principles of justice and truth, or the principles of privilege and power. And the more you make concessions to those who serve the principles of privilege and power, the more you diminish the capacity to further justice and truth. That all of the true correctives in American democracy never came by anyone who achieved formal political power. The Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. The question, as Karl Popper says in The Open Society and Its Enemies, is not how do we get good people to rule. That's the wrong question. Most people, as Popper writes, who are attracted to power are at best mediocre, which is Obama, or venal, which is Bush. The question is, how do we stop the powerful from doing as much damage as possible? And you could argue that until April of 1968, the most powerful political figure in the United States was Martin Luther King. Because when he went to Memphis, 50,000 people went with him. And when he got up at Riverside Church in April of 1967 and denounced the Vietnam War, he terrified Johnson and the liberal establishment that had served as cheerleaders for that war, which is why Johnson removed the 4 plainclothes FBI agents who had provided his security detail, a move that both Johnson and King knew what it would lead to. So any discussion of a movement to challenge the culture of permanent war means active defiance against all of the established structures of power including all of our liberal institutions. And I just want to close by talking about, in my mind, the failure of the liberal church. I grew up in the church. My father was a Presbyterian minister who, for his stances, was driven roundly from one pulpit to the next. First for his support of the civil rights movement. I grew up in an all-white farm town where Martin Luther King was one of the most hated men in America. He was a sergeant in North Africa in World War II. He came back hating war and hating the military. He told me when I was about 12 that if the war in Vietnam was still being fought when I was 18 and I was drafted, he would go to prison with me. And to this day, I have carried with me an image of sitting in a jail cell for 2 years with my dad. And finally, he was a vocal supporter of the gay rights movement in the 1970s, calling for the ordination, full gender equality for gays. His brother was gay. My uncle lived with his partner in Greenwich Village. And I think the church was probably least tolerant of this stance. And the retreat by the liberal church, like the secular culture, into issues of identity politics or tolerance, which of course is a word Martin Luther King never used, or inclusiveness, became self-absorbed and narcissistic because fundamentally they forgot about the primacy of justice. The church failed us in standing up to the Christian heretics who dominate the Christian right. They forgot that heretics exist. Jesus did not come to make us rich. Jesus did not bless the dropping of iron fragmentation bombs all over the Middle East. And I don't understand how you can go, as I did through 3 years of seminary, and study the Christian Gospels and walk out into the wider world and see a figure like Joel Osteen or Pat Robertson or Rod Parsley and not say anything. As if the radical message of the Christian gospel was not something we would have to fight for. And the liberal church, because it retreated into what I believe is a faux kind of spirituality, a kind of how is it with me narcissism, abrogated a moral voice at a moment in time and in American history when we so desperately need it. My own denomination, the Presbyterian, is split between evangelicals and an aging and declining traditional liberal population, and so therefore the leaders of the church want to say nothing. They don't want to offend either group, and in the end, essentially silence themselves at a time when we so desperately need moral renewal. I agree with what Paul said, that I come out of the spiritual left, I come out of the Catholic worker, and Dan Berrigan, who I just had lunch with last week, will be 90 in a few days. That holding fast to that moral imperative, no matter what the consequences. Understanding that we have to do something not because it's practical or that it will work, but because it's right. And I think that part of that call is going to include or must include taking that very lonely and solitary step, one which will see us, especially as the upcoming presidential elections get underway, be reviled and denounced. But I think we can no longer cooperate with self-identified liberals who speak in that kind of feel your pain language that Obama and Clinton have perfected, and yet who carry out slavishly the policies of the war industry and the corporate state, the reconfiguration of American society into a kind of frightening neo-feudalism. And it's up to us, because if we don't grasp the betrayal and the rage as legitimate by especially working men and women, it will be ceded to these proto-fascist movements, who will, as all movements do, single out weak scapegoats in the society to be targeted. You first get people to speak in the language of violence. I know I covered conflicts for 20 years before you get them to carry out acts of violence. And there is nothing benign about the language or the celebration of the gun culture by these movements, because in a societal breakdown, that step towards the actual employment of violence is very small.